Thank you. You know, the news is a weird thing. And several years ago, something really strange took over the news cycle and I think gave us a fascinating peek into what people believe and how we believe it. In a way, it was like a very large social science experiment that was happening in real time. It was the spring of 2019, and we began hearing about Americans who are dying mysteriously while they were on vacation in the Dominican Republic. Anyone remember that? Well, at one point, it felt like almost every other day there was yet another report about this strange phenomenon that was popping up. When it was on traditional legacy news outlets, the network news, and on social media as well. The Dominican Republic, normally perfectly safe and popular destination for a vacation or business, suddenly felt sinister. I knew people who were considering visiting there, but they canceled their trips. They said, "There's no way I'm ever going there." Obviously dangerous. Here's what we know. In 2019, 11 Americans died in the Dominican Republic. That is a fact. In some cases, the cause of death was not immediately known. So yes, that sounds mysterious, but then came the beliefs about that, the rumors, the conspiracy theories. Some claimed that Americans were being poisoned by tainted alcohol. But after an FBI investigation, no foul play was ever found. The causes of death ranged from respiratory failure to drowning to traffic accidents. In other words, as sad as it was that anyone died while they were on vacation or a business trip, people do die. And those same people would have very likely died whether they were visiting the Dominican Republic or Sweden or Japan. Here's the kicker. In 2015, 4 years before, 30 Americans died in the Dominican Republic. In 2017, 17 Americans died there. In 2019, it was down to 11. So the actual death rate in the Dominican Republic was declining. Statistically, Americans are far more likely to die of homicide right here in the United States than of any unnatural cause in the Dominican Republic. So why was there such this enormous hubbub about this in the spring and summer of 2019? And it was because of what people believed about it. Not because of facts, but because of fear, because of repetition, and because of emotion. No matter how smart or how educated we are, none of us are immune from that. I agreed with my friends who were not about to visit the Dominican Republic. You wouldn't catch me going there. Paul Zak is a neuroscientist at Claremont Graduate University, and he studies beliefs like that. He says our brains don't simply absorb facts and then form beliefs. It's really the other way around. We form beliefs first, and then we fit facts to support those beliefs. And our beliefs do not need to make rational sense to be deeply held. Why? Because beliefs are deeply emotional things. They're tied to who we are, to our identity, and the more emotionally charged a belief is, the harder it is to challenge it. When we feel that our beliefs are under attack, our brains go into high alert mode. The amygdala, that's the part of our brain that's designed to protect us from harm. It's our fear center. And when our beliefs are challenged, our amygdala fires up. And the insula is the part of our brain that processes gut-level reactions. The insula tells us that that hot dog we're about to bite into might be spoiled because it just smells off. Both of those go into overdrive whenever something threatens a deeply held idea that we have. And sometimes that makes perfect sense. If anyone insisted that Adolf Hitler was not really a bad guy, he was just misunderstood, we would instantly react to that with revulsion and scorn, and rightly so. But other times, our beliefs, especially the beliefs we hold about ourselves, can keep us from moving forward in constructive ways. Many years ago, I served a church, and that church had really been through some hard times. And after I had been there a while, I came across an official church history they had published about 20 years before. In that official history, there was a single sentence, one line, noting that their historic parsonage, it was an old Victorian mansion that was located right next door to the church, it had been torn down in the early 1980s. What that brief account failed to mention was the firestorm I knew that decision had caused. The parsonage had originally been this lovely place where the ministers of the church lived, but over time the ministers opted to live elsewhere. So the parsonage was subdivided into apartments and rented out. This went on for several decades, but then the maintenance and upkeep just became way too much and gradually fell into disrepair. The cost of keeping it up or renovating it was just more than anyone could stomach. And there were two camps of people, one that wanted to try to preserve this building, and the other that said it was just far too gone and expensive to ever restore, sadly enough. Well, eventually, the church voted to demolish it, but that division ran very deep. Many people left the church over this, some out of principle, others just out of sheer frustration at the process, because it got very, very ugly. One church member even sued the church. The pastor at the time, who was caught in the middle of this, resigned about 18 months later. And for decades afterward, that story lived on, because when I arrived and I started hearing about it almost immediately when I got there, I assumed, well, it must have happened just a few years earlier, because members of the church were describing it with such intense emotions. But it had been 35 years before. It was central to the church's narrative, the story they told. The belief had taken hold that the church had lost something essential when that happened. Something about the church then was fundamentally broken. So the parsonage story became this cautionary tale. It became a symbol of something greater than itself, of that church's decline and all the problems they ever had or that they continued to struggle with. It was a wound that just refused to be healed. Now, I never dismissed their pain, but I did find myself wondering, is this really the story we're still telling about ourselves around here? Are we going to let an event from a generation ago define who we are and our future? It reminded me somewhat of the way people in some places in the American South, when I was growing up, still spoke of losing the Civil War, as if it had happened last week. I had relatives who felt that way. So eventually at that church, we began to shift the narrative. We started by asking, what story do we choose to believe about ourselves today? Because there's a difference between acknowledging what happened in the past and being held captive to it. We can honor history without allowing it to limit what's possible. We can acknowledge our past without allowing it to dictate who God intends us to be. And that's not just true for institutions, it's true for each and every one of us. What stories, what beliefs do we continue to tell about ourselves that really no longer serve any purpose? Stories like, I'll never be enough. I've failed far too often. I just don't belong. I don't matter. We all carry stories like that, but they're not the only stories available. The brain, the same one that clings to the past, also has a marvelous ability because it can imagine a better future. Jonas Kaplan teaches at the Brain and Creativity Institute at USC. He's shown that the very same regions in our brain that hold our beliefs are also what light up when we envision what's not happened yet, even when there's no factual basis for thinking those things we envision ever could happen. It reminds me of something I once read in the Bible. Oh, we heard it this morning. It's about how faith operates, the incredible power of faith. Faith is not pretending that we have all the answers. Faith is believing that a better way forward exists, even if we can't yet see that way. few years ago, I read a book by Douglas Brinkley. It's called American Moonshot. Great book. It's about President Kennedy and the space race. When JFK said in 1962 that we would put a human being on the moon by the end of the decade, most of the technology required to do that had not even been invented yet. The people at NASA, though, they believed it could happen, in theory, but in practice, they figured it out as they went, one step at a time, because they believed in a story about themselves, that it could be done, and they were the ones who could do it, that they could and they would land on the moon. So they took a leap of faith. That's what faith is. Many leaps of faith into the unknown, into the unseen. And that belief that they held changed history, of course. Faith is what makes progress possible. Faith is not blind. It's the determination to keep on going even when the path is not clear. It's believing that we are far more than our past. It's trusting that we are equipped with what we need, not in advance, as if we've gone to REI and loaded up on everything, but as we move forward. Now, today's passage from Hebrews reminds us that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. It was written to a small Jewish Christian community that could have been in Rome, possibly even in Jerusalem, so it might have been part of the original Christian church. And the author of Hebrews points to their ancestors as the models of their faith. Abraham and Sarah, they left home not knowing where they were going. The Israelites fled Egypt into the unknown, the wilderness. All those people had baggage. They all had reasons to doubt, but they believed in something much larger. They walked forward anyway. They moved toward the promise of what could be. And so can we. Faith does not mean ignoring the facts. It means refusing to be defined by them alone. Faith is, it's a declaration that we are not going to be limited by whatever has been. Faith is not static. It moves, it risks, it dreams. Faith, it cuts through any fear or anxiety about the present state of things. We have a lot to be anxious about, and it doesn't deny that times are challenging and discouraging, that many of our basic notions of justice and decency and common sense are being cast aside, but faith also refuses to stand for that, or to let that be the story of who we are as a people, because faith is confident that a brighter future is ahead of us. And as a church, faith is how we move beyond any old story about who we once were and live into the story God is still telling. Hearing the words, God is still speaking about us. We are a people of faith. We have the God-given gift of belief, and the story God tells about us is never about scarcity or the mythical good old days. It's a story of grace and renewal and courage and possibility right now and into our future. So may we believe in that story. May we live into that story, and may that very true story shape who we are today and every single day. Amen.